So, yeah, this week we start the NFL season. I'm pretty excited about that. Football season. College football started off like this last weekend. It didn't start off so great for Boise State, but that's all right. And then the Chiefs will kick off the NFL season on Thursday. And I want to start this morning by sharing one of my favorite football stories. And believe it or not, it's not a story about the Kansas City Chiefs. It's a story that was told in an edition of Sports Illustrated years ago by a writer named Rick Riley. And he told this story about two teams from Texas high school football, the Grapevine Lions and the Gainesville Tornadoes. And it was a bit of an odd story because what happened was there were people from Grapevine. Grapevine was the home team. And yet there were over 200 fans from Grapevine sitting over in the Gainesville stands. And then on top of that, there were actually parents of kids on the Grapevine team. And they were sitting in the Gainesville stands, and they were cheering for the Gainesville players, like, by name, and, like, yelling for them, saying, "Hit my son." Even, this is another crazy thing, they made a spirit line with a tornado on the end of it for the Gainesville players to run through. Grapevine players, they're the Lions. They didn't get a spirit line that day. And then when they get to the end of the game, the score was Grapevine Lions 33, Gainesville Tornadoes 14. Home team won, and the Tornadoes, their record was 0-9. Hadn't won a game all season. And yet, you couldn't tell because all of the players were giving their coach a squirt bottle shower in celebration at the end of the game. That had never happened before. And when they interviewed the quarterback, the losing quarterback, Isaiah was his name, he says, "I never thought I'd hear people cheering for us to hit their kids. I wouldn't expect a parent to tell somebody to hit their kids, but they wanted us to." And all of that, I think, makes me ask this question: what kind of parent would cheer against their own kids and cheer for the opposing team? I'm going to come back to that question, and to get to the answer to that question, we're going to go to, away from my favorite football story, we're going to go to what I think is God's favorite Old Testament story. And in God's favorite Old Testament story, we'll find out a little bit about what could make parents cheer against their own kids for an opposing team. Genesis 22 is the story of Abraham and Isaac. And that's where we're going to get to today. But before we get there, we need to get there. We need to take a quick look at the context and what's been happening in Abraham's life up to this point. When we first met Abraham, he was 75 years old, and his name was still Abram. But that was like 10 chapters ago. In Genesis 12, where Katie read for us, God's promise to him, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all people will be blessed through you." And there were many trials and dangers that threatened that blessing. And every time that there was a trial or a danger that would threaten the blessing that God had promised to Abraham, God came through and proved himself faithful. God was able to keep his promise. So you could go back to Genesis 12:10. That's where Abram is facing a famine, and the famine is going to take Abraham from the land that God had promised, and it takes Abraham down to the land of Egypt so that he can find enough food. How can God keep his promise to Abraham if Abraham's not in the land where God said that the promise needed to happen? But God is faithful to his promise. When they're down in Egypt, there's a Pharaoh down there, and he sees that Abraham's wife is awfully good looking, and he wants to take her for his own wife. And how can God's promise happen if Abraham's wife is with another king? And yet God preserves the promise. He is faithful to his promise. A couple chapters later, in chapter 14, Abraham's nephew Lot, he gets kidnapped by King Kedorlaomer, and Abraham just goes into battle to rescue Lot. But But there's a threat there. Like, what happens if Abraham dies in battle? And yet, God is faithful to his promise. In the next chapter, chapter 15, Abraham decides that since he doesn't have an heir, he'll appoint Eleazar to be his heir, and he'll get everything that God has already given to Abraham. And God is faithful to his promise. We get to chapter 16, and Abraham finally has a son. But it's with the wrong mother, with Hagar and not with Sarah. And what's going to happen to Ishmael and Hagar? And we see that God is faithful to his promise. And then we get over to chapter 20, and now Abraham encounters another king. His name's Abimelech, and this king has the same idea that Pharaoh had, wants to take Sarah as his wife, and Abraham didn't learn his lesson, so a second time he says, yeah, she's just my sister, and a second time another king has his wife, and again, how can the promise be fulfilled if someone else has Sarah? But again, that story is resolved, and God is faithful to his promise. And you see the pattern. From Genesis chapter 12 all the way through Genesis chapter 20, time after time, a situation would come up that would threaten God's blessing and promise, but every time God was faithful and God saved that blessing. And so finally we get to Genesis chapter 21, and Abraham at the age of 100 and Sarah at the age of 90 become the proud parents of baby Isaac, the promised heir. And they settle down in Beersheba, get a nice little house with a white picket fence, and they're changing Isaac's pampers while they're changing their own Depends, and they're enjoying the blessing that God has promised. And that's when we get to chapter 22. And chapter 22 begins, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that I will show you. We just have to pause and sit in that verse and say, what kind of God would ask this kind of sacrifice from a person? I mean, up to this point, we have seen that God has proved faithful in preserving his blessing against every threat, every outside threat that could possibly threaten this blessing. God has proven himself faithful, but now there is a new threat, and it's coming from God himself. And there's no question about what God is asking Abraham to do. You can see it right there in the text. He makes it explicit. He says, your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And all throughout the entire story in this chapter, you'll see those phrases repeated over and over again. And each time you can feel the wound in Abraham's heart. Dig a little deeper. You know what amazes me is in the next verse, how verse 3 begins. Verse 3 begins early the next morning. Abraham actually begins to obey God early the next morning. And that's why this is the story of Abraham and not the story of Vance. Because if this was the story of Vance, there would be a lot of questions in verse 3. Verse 3 would say, are you sure, God? Why? Can you give me a good reason why you would be asking me for this kind of sacrifice? How do I know if I can trust you, God? And yet, it's Abraham's story, and it's not Vance's story. And so verse 3, Abraham begins in obedience early the next morning. And they walk. Abraham and Isaac walk for 3 days. And for 3 days of walking, he has to live with this confusion, this tension of how will God's covenant promises be carried out now. And for 3 days, Abraham could try to rationalize some other course of action to take in order to get himself out of doing what God had asked him to do. But for 3 days, Abraham and Isaac walk. And it's not the first time that God had challenged Abraham, not the first time that God had called Abraham's name. If you go back to the beginning of Abraham's story in chapter 12, God called Abraham's name, and he told him to leave his town and leave his father and mother and leave that city of Ur and go into a land that he would tell him about. And when Abraham obeyed that calling of God, he cut himself off from his past. But now, as God calls Abraham's name again, he's asking him to cut himself off from his future. So what kind of God asks someone to make this kind of sacrifice? I think the answer to that question is the kind of God who wants to know what you love most. Do you love God's blessings, or do you love the God who gives the blessings? God had promised Abraham to bless him and beyond his wildest dreams, but this test will determine what is it that Abraham loves most, God or God's blessings. Often what happens in our lives is that our greatest blessings will frequently become our greatest tests. A few years in college has a way of becoming an altar on which the blessings of God are sacrificed. Everyone in this room is making a sacrifice in some way. The money that you paid for tuition is a sacrifice. You sacrifice your time and you sacrifice your energy to do your homework instead of the fun that you could be having. Perhaps you sacrifice the potential of a different kind of career in a different field that would offer you more financial security. Maybe one day you're going to sacrifice by saying goodbye to friends and family in a culture that you're comfortable with in order to go somewhere else around the world to share the gospel. I don't know what your sacrifice might be, but everyone who comes to the altar sacrifices something, and the something that we sacrifice is always something that is good. It is a good thing that we put on the altar. It is something that is valuable. It is something of worth, because it wouldn't be a sacrifice if it was worthless. And so when we come to the altar, it is a blessing that we offer. It is something good and something valuable that we would like to keep to ourselves. And when we're asked to lay that good blessing on the altar and to give it back to that God, to the God who gave it to us, and the altar asks, will the blessing become your primary affection and then turn into an idol? Or will that blessing actually cause your love for God to increase? This is the question that was faced by the rich young ruler. He comes up to Jesus and he asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And the guy's already rich, he's already young, he's already a ruler. He's got about everything that you could ask for. The one thing that he's trying to expand his resume, expand his pedigree by saying he's blessed. He's got the approval of a very famous, well-known rabbi. And Jesus asks about keeping some commandments. He's already done all of those. Okay, then good. Now go and sell everything that you have and give it to the poor. Then come, follow me. Just chew on that for just a second. Do you know how many people got the personal invitation from the mouth of Jesus to come follow me? He's number 13. And he went away sad because he loved the blessings more than he loved the God who gave them. Romans chapter 12 describes our Christian life. Paul says, therefore, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your reasonable act of worship. And you catch the paradox in the phrasing that Paul uses there. It says a living sacrifice. There's a reason that we usually kill the animals before we put them up on the altar. They have a habit of getting off, of hopping off the altar. They like to leave the altar and hop off because the altar is not a comfortable place to live. But Paul calls us to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. I know a lot of people, maybe you've thought this or said this yourself, a lot of people who have thought about that they would be willing to die for Jesus if such an extreme situation were to arise. There's a lot to respect about that. But are you willing to die to yourself for Jesus? And all those little altar moments that come in between. Those little altar moments when you've got to stay up 2 more hours to finish that homework. Or when you're already tired, but there's something that has to be taken care of at church. Or when there's that high maintenance, extra grace required weird kid in the youth group, and if you don't share Jesus' love with him, no one else will. Do we have the guts to make those sacrifices? Do we have the guts to make those kinds of sacrifices if no one else sees us and no one else pats us on the back and no one else gives us the praise that we feel like we deserve for making such a magnanimous sacrifice of our life? And in those moments, those moments where your head hits the pillow and you know that you have been poured out. And as you just drift off to sleep, you just pray, Jesus, that was for you. I hope you like it. And then you get up the next day to do it again. In those moments, when we pray that prayer and God looks at us and he says, as he said to Abraham, now I know that you fear God. And the story continues here in Genesis 22 and verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and he loaded his donkey and he took with him his 2 servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance and he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I go over there with the boy and we will worship and then we will come back to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and he placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, and he bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand, and he took the knife, laid his son. And this scene slows down into slow motion. And you can see the sweat on Abraham's face and the tears that are streaming down Abraham's cheeks. And you can see his hand tremble as he's just waiting for that voice to call out one more time. And as Abraham resolves to bring the knife down to pierce his son's heart, another heart is pierced first. Before Isaac's heart is pierced, God's heart is pierced. And God says, no. Stop. Keep your blessing. but use the blessing for my purpose. I will take care of the sacrifice. In verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns, and he went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, and your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. The kind of God who asks us to make this sacrifice is the kind of God who wants to know if we love his blessings or him more first. But there's a second answer to this question, because what kind of God would ask us to make this sacrifice? It's the kind of God who would be willing to sacrifice his own son. I think that this is God's favorite Old Testament story because there's this other story in the New Testament. A story about another son, an only son, a son whom the father loved, a son that was led to the top of another mountain. And again, that son carried the wood for the sacrifice on his own back. And again, that son questioned the father. My God, why have you forsaken me? And again, the son was laid upon the wood to be sacrificed. But on that day, there was no voice to stop the blade in midair. On that day, there was no ram to substitute as a sacrifice. On that day, the son was pierced. And on that day, the father wept and mourned the death of his son. And on that day, I think God's heart was pierced again. But on that day, rather than a ram instead of the son, it was the son instead of you. And when God asks us to get on the altar of sacrifice, he is not asking us to do anything that he has not already done himself. And when you encounter the God who asked you to sacrifice, remember that you were encountering the God who was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, the kind of God who was willing to sacrifice his own son. When the Texas football game was over, the answers became more clear. The Gainesville team headed back and lined up in front of their bus, and all of them were placed in handcuffs. Then they loaded that bus that said Gainesville Juvenile Detention Center and drove away. But before they drove away, there was an interview with the coach of the home team, the Grapevine Lions. His name was Chris Hogan, and they asked Chris Hogan, why did you do this? Why did you have why did you have parents cheering for the opposing team? And he said that the message was that he wanted those students to hear the message that they are just as valuable as any other person on earth. And as he was trying to orchestrate this in the weeks before this game, there were parents and there were boosters who didn't like the idea. They didn't think that they should be cheering for a bunch of convicted drug dealers and convicted kids convicted of assault and robbery. And why would you cheer for a bunch of convicts instead of our own kids? But Coach Hogan said, imagine if you didn't have much of a home life. Imagine if everyone had just pretty much given up on you. And then imagine what it would look like and how it would feel if suddenly hundreds of people believed in you. So when the clock went down to 0 and the game was over, both teams came to the 50-yard line and they knelt in prayer. And Isaiah, that quarterback from the Gainesville Tornadoes, he prayed this: Lord, I don't know how this happened, so I don't know how to say thank you. But I never would have known that there were so many people in the world that cared about us. The author of Hebrews says it this way: by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, and he who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." And Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Abraham is the father of faith because Abraham believed in the power of the resurrection 2,000 years before resurrection power came to this earth. The grapevine parents could cheer for a bunch of criminals to hit their own kids because they knew about the power of the resurrection. And you can choose to live your life on an altar of sacrifice daily because of the power of the resurrection. Because there is nothing that you can sacrifice for God that God cannot bring back to life. Jesus, thank you for your sacrifice. God, thank you that you are a God who doesn't ask anything of us that you haven't already done yourself. So God, thank you for your sacrifice for us. Thank you for our abundant blessings. Please accept them as we give them back to you because we love you most. In Jesus' name.